Okay. Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Teaching Archive and Collective Thought micro symposium on the really amazing recent book, The Teaching Archive, A New History for Literary Study. Through the Blur is right here, by Rachel Sagner-Burma and Laura Heffernan. I'm Nathan Hensley at Georgetown, and I'm happy to be a really tiny part of this collaborative enterprise. It really is a collective project. Which came about after some of us here just began to think aloud online together about how much we were learning from Rachel and Laura's book, the new ideas it was helping to shape for us about the dense interrelation between teaching and that thing that now goes by the name of research. My role here is really tiny, so I'll just say only a few quick words of welcome and then I'll get out of the way. Before we start, however, I want to acknowledge that one of the early collaborators on this enterprise, Rebecca Munson, passed away this summer as we were putting together this event. I didn't know Rebecca personally, but I'll quote from a public tribute that was written by one of our own participants here, Meredith Martin. Meredith wrote that, quote, Rebecca was a beloved friend, colleague, scholar, and mentor who, quote, allowed us to share in her vulnerability and courage and taught us in turn to be both vulnerable and brave. Her smile, her humor, her wit, her fierce intellect, her capacity for joy, and her generous, generous, generous spirit that never stopped fighting to live and never stopped fighting for what she believed in, we will carry these with us always. We are all very sorry Rebecca can't be with us here today, but she is with us nonetheless. Our short discussion here today will consist of 5 short presentations, no longer than 6 minutes, timed on this cheap watch. And a short response from Laura and Rachel. Then we'll open things up for discussion. And our hope is that this can really be a regular meeting among friends and colleagues. In other words, that the audience will be participants and vice versa. Rebecca Ariel Port, my co-host here, will read bios as we go, and then she'll close things out, and we'll be done by 1:30. 2 last notes, as I mentioned before, to make things more collaborative, this is a regular Zoom meeting and not a webinar, which means your mics and cameras are not automatically shut off. So just please mute when you're not speaking. And please be aware that for accessibility purposes, the event is recorded and will be posted with closed captions to the Georgetown YouTube page. Just to be aware of that. Finally, I want to thank the Georgetown Humanities Initiative and the Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice here for some small sponsorship money to help make this possible. And most of all, I want to thank our group of speakers, participants, and co-organizers and audience members and collaborators. I'm really excited for this. So I'm done, and I'll hand things over to the very brilliant Rebecca Ariel Port. Rebecca?
Such a kind introduction. This phase of things, we'll begin with our presenters who come from a variety of different kinds of institutional backgrounds and who are going to be thinking about different aspects of the questions and the possibilities that the Teaching Archive raises about our relationships to pedagogy and about our relationships to knowledge formation and circulation, I think, as well. So we'll begin with Stacy Amo, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Writing, Language, and Literature at the University of Wisconsin-Superior. She teaches across the entire English curriculum and is at work on a project that examines childhood in the wild western frontier of climate change fiction. So take it away, Stacy.
All right, thank you. And a quick thank you to everyone presenting, attending, and sponsoring today's event, and of course to Rachel and Laura for writing this book. Reading the Teaching Archive for the first time was a fascinating experience, as I was shown that so much of what was presented to me as innovative or even radical pedagogy in graduate school actually has a long tradition in English classrooms. And Rachel and Laura point out that these practices have been rebranded in our contemporary moment as, quote, innovative interventions designed to help a casualized faculty do ever more with ever less in times of economic, employment, and now pandemic crises. This repackaging was only ever possible, as this book demonstrates, because of the problematic institutional separation of teaching and research and the associated devaluing of one while privileging the other, thus creating a massive gap in the history of our discipline, a history of teaching, and one that they point out in the introduction has been absent from other histories of our discipline that have been published. Rachel and Laura compellingly argue against this separation by showing how teaching fueled by student interactions and interests in classrooms from Berkeley to community colleges and extension courses was paramount to the creation and evolution of research and scholarly publications in the 20th century for the teachers included in the teaching archive. Knowledge then in these classrooms visibly trickles upwards too, as these archives illuminate the roles students play as active co-creators in the classroom. But introducing complex research methods, indexing, attending to primary sources, collaborating on reading choices, etc., were not practices undertaken to inaugurate students as literary scholars or to teach embryo professors. It was a sustained practice across all types of classrooms and student populations that might have had no aspirations at all to pursue a degree in English. For the teachers studied here, the clearly symbiotic relationship between research and teaching shapes and informs both classroom practices and formal scholarly publications. The genealogy of these final published ideas are traced with and through these archives, some admittedly more skeletal than others because teaching papers were unsurprisingly not frequently deemed worthy of inclusion in an archive if they weren't already tossed out at the end of each semester. Importantly, many of the classrooms examined in the teaching archive are like the ones many of us find ourselves in today, especially those of us who are in non-tenure track, adjunct, or other contingent faculty positions at regional public universities and community colleges. These everyday institutions were and are still of utmost importance to our discipline, as they are the spaces where the most reading is done and meaning is made. Yet Rachel and Laura also astutely note in their conclusion that changes in state funding allotted to campuses, financial crises, and misguided attempts to solve the resulting university budgetary crises through elimination of largely liberal arts programs and tenure track faculty positions, quote, threaten to make liberal arts education the province of wealthy private universities alone, while everyone else narrows their focus to job training. I see the pitting of liberal arts degrees against career preparation and university rhetoric echoed in the different values associated with on-campus teaching versus online teaching. Questions about online teaching have, of course, been pushed to the forefront as a necessity stemming from COVID, although public universities and community colleges have been increasing their online offerings over the last decade to reach new audiences. Rather than seeing distance learning as a second-tier education, one that has traditionally been relegated to majors we associate with direct career paths or corrupt for-profit institutions, how can we think creatively in this moment, despite how exhausted we are, about ways in which online courses can still inspire spontaneous and collaborative work? How does this expand the potentiality of the tactile and kinesthetic space of the in-person classroom, or what is eclipsed by a shift to virtual learning? What might we learn from institutions like mine that are slowly beginning to recognize that a rural and non-traditional students may want something more than career preparation, and that a more rigorous liberal arts classroom doesn't create an adversarial environment for them? Despite the increase of liberal arts courses offered online both before and during COVID, there remains a clear division between the two in the eyes of many administrators. On-campus learning is not regularly subject to review and oversight in ways that would limit a creative and flexible classroom, thus continuing to foster the type of intellectual communities formed and discussed throughout the teaching archive. But this intellectual and creative freedom is not necessarily extended to online classrooms and students, particularly in asynchronous classes. Administrations insisting upon courses being 100% complete weeks or months before the semester even starts, with mandatory course review by well-meaning staff or instructional designers, seemingly actively discourages a classroom in which student input and interest can shape assignments, content, and readings of a course, because the work is done before we know who our students are, what they're interested in, or what their backgrounds are. Many of the rubrics used to assess online classes, like Quality Matters, don't even consider content in their evaluations. And how have I and others been complicit and failed to push back against these institutional practices that devalue even the most basic of disciplinary best teaching practices because of our precarious position as instructional staff rather than faculty? Ultimately, for me, the teaching archive complicates our history of the discipline in ways that necessitates a vigorous analysis of our own teaching methods and to look at how we have been shaped as teachers and scholars, particularly those of us who have come to age in the profession after 2008, knowing primarily austerity and crisis.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Already so many, I think, of the heart issues of the situation on the table, and I'm so looking forward to seeing how people will take up the baton later in the session. So next of our presenters is Nadine Atwell, who is Associate Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University, where she also directs the undergraduate program in Global Asia. She is the author of Better Britons, Reproduction, National Identity, and the Afterlife of Empire, and is currently at work on a second book entitled Archives of Intimacy, Racial Mixing and Asian Lives in the Colonial Port City. Nadine.
Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you first to Nathan for the invitation to join this conversation, and to Rachel and Laura for the book that's brought us together. I'm excited to be here. It's also a little odd to be here since, as Rebecca mentioned, I'm currently appointed in the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and direct an undergraduate program in Global Asia. However, all of my degrees are in English, and all of my previous jobs until this year were in English departments, most recently in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster. So I've learned to describe myself as a scholar of empire, intimacy, and Asian diasporic life, whose work is feminist, queer, anti-colonial, anti-racist in methodology and orientation. But I was trained to describe myself as a scholar of modernist and post-colonial literature. And so I came to the teaching archive as someone who's been thinking about the discipline of English and its curricular manifestations for many years, and who continues to feel that disciplinary inheritance in my research and teaching, but who no longer really inhabits disciplinary spaces, the disciplinary spaces of English, comfortably or otherwise, and who's also thinking quite a bit these days about how to build curricula in an interdisciplinary formation, Global Asia, that's new and has its own sort of imperial ghosts. So with that sort of sense of my history, I want to share a couple of things. Reading the teaching archive spoke to a hunger that I didn't know that I had for accounts of the discipline grounded in the everyday work of literature teachers. So thing one is really just this, that I feel like we need, or at least I want, more of these, more accounts that encompass more classrooms, more kinds of classrooms in more places, but also more accounts that encompass more kinds of institutional labor that attend more specifically to the work that goes into building and administering curricula at the level of the department. So what we often call service work or administrative labor. And let me quickly say why. In the book I'm writing now, I think a lot about the work that goes into building different kinds of collectives, work that's often feminized, neglected. We often call it social reproductive labor. I use the term relation work, but this is at the same time work that really shapes, I think, what those collectives are like and what they're able to do. And the teaching archive has prompted me to consider how this is also true of institutions and disciplinary formations, including the ones that I work in. So the how, right, shaping the what, as I learned many years ago in English 100 courses. So that's a kind of intellectual, a bit more abstract, but more pragmatically, I think we're in a moment where, of course, there's so much renewed conversation about how we might dismantle, transform the colonial monument that is the English department, which is exciting. As most of us understand, this is not a project that can happen only at the level of the individual syllabus or classroom. It's a collective project, a curricular project, an institutional project, with all of the challenges that this entails. And so ultimately, for me, I'm less interested here in the accuracy of the teaching archive's account of English's history as an academic discipline, although I think we can have conversations about that as well, than I am in what we might do with the knowledges that are opened up by such accounts, how they might serve, in other words, a project of political education inside the institution and also beyond it. In the spirit of the teaching archive, then, I want to say a few words about a different kind of archive, but a related one, an archive of institutional labor. When I arrived at Cornell as a new PhD student in 2000, I learned about the work of the Radical Caucus, an activist collective of 15 Cornell English PhD and MFA students who had recently released a startlingly detailed and wide-ranging 80-page report of the state of the department. And that was in April 1998. In its report, which I recently dug up and reread, the Radical Caucus surveyed the department and called for the wholesale transformation of its curriculum, governance mechanisms, operational procedures, doctoral program requirements, labor policies, and pedagogical offerings. Guiding the caucus's efforts was the question of how English as methodology, disciplinary formation, and departmental structure might continue to, quote, transform itself in meaningful intellectual ways after the initial thrill of the canon debates and the legitimation of minority discourses, with the aim of developing critical, reflective, ethical thinkers who may in their daily lives and work analyze and counter the dominance without hegemony of the political right, end quote. Together with an archive of materials relating to its production and reception, a genius move, I think, the report was deposited for safekeeping in the library and continues to circulate digitally amongst graduate students in digital form to this day. It has its limits, of course. Among other things, the caucus neglects Jay Saunders Redding's contributions to the teaching of African-American literature at Cornell, and Hortense Villers sort of notes this in her response to the report. But what a rare and astonishing gift, nonetheless, underscoring the point that the department's senior post-colonialist, Viadin Jayafo, made in his response to the report, that, quote, we do not seem to be sufficiently informed in our work and in general intellectual atmosphere by a deep, sustaining sense of the historicity of the department's identity, of people who were here in the past and how we are connected to them. It certainly doesn't help that the people who engage in this kind of transformative work that many of us are committed to doing so often leave or are forced out. But as a consequence, we don't always have a sense of the genealogies of knowledge and resistance on which we might be drawing inside and outside of the classroom. And we also lack a fine-grained sense very often, in my experience, of the terrain on which we struggle, to evoke Stuart Hall. Sarah Ahmed says that histories shape what surfaces, and we often don't know why things are surfacing now in the way they are, and that can make it harder to maneuver. In other words, I think these are knowledges we need for the work we want to do. And they're also, and this is something I think the Radical Caucus understood very well, a really crucial part of the work. And as burned out as we all are, I'd love to see that on our agendas for the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nadine. Already so many kind of complementary things to link to Stacy's presentation. And I'm particularly interested to take up later the idea of what can we do with this kind of knowledge, which I think is just the right way of framing the question. So next, we're going to hear from Meredith Martin, who teaches at Princeton in the English department and has since 2013 been the faculty director of the Center for Digital Humanities, which she started. She is PI of the ongoing Princeton Prosody Archive project, which collects thousands of published pedagogical materials about the teaching of English poetry and grammar.
Thank you. I will start my timer because I had a really hard time, for the reasons that Nathan mentioned at the beginning, opening my file for the class that I co-taught with Rebecca Munson, on literature, data, and interpretation this past spring. So my presentation is a little bit different in that it's actually about what it meant to teach with the Teaching Archive. I think I might be one of the first that got to do that. Rebecca and I were so thrilled when the book came out in time for us to include it on our spring course and to share it as the first course that the class read together. So it was a wonderful frame. The questions that we were asking, the course was called Literature, Data, and Interpretation, and it was a methods course for graduate students at Princeton who were interested in digital humanities and critical archival studies. And we asked them why and how literary criticism has relied on or resisted quantitative methods. We surveyed current debates about evidence, digital humanities, cultural analytics, and talked about new and old methods of evaluating data as evidence across disciplines. So we wanted the students to come to this class really thinking critically about their own disciplinary formations. They came from East Asian studies, religion, history, English, comparative literature, Near Eastern studies. and I'm missing one or two more, but it was not an English class. It was a very interesting disciplinary hodgepodge. And so we talked a lot about method, a lot about what each of their particular formations as graduate students brought to the question of evidence and quantitative evidence, whether it had the same kind of overdetermination as it has, at least currently in English. And so one of the most wonderful things about beginning with the Teaching Archive was to show, of course, as this book does so beautifully, how so many of these binaries that have appeared to us in our narratives of what we do as engines of disagreement, right? Formalism versus historicism, or service versus research, or teaching versus research, or quantitative evidence versus interpretive interpretive choices are actually just sort of made up. Like they just sort of spun out into nothingness in the beautiful ways that the book narrates that kind of overlapping and interweaving of knowledge formation that we really undertake every day. So it was a wonderful way to begin a class. It gave us a way to think not just about why we might hold some of these binaries so solid, like what's at stake for the profession in doing so, and who it gives power to do that, but also how certain stories get told because of which data, which information is accessible. And so that helped us really think about critical archival studies, how hierarchies of institutional value really shape our understanding, and thinking through archives as a way to get through data and interpretation and sort of the concept of whatever digital humanities even means, really pushed us to think about how our profession relies so much on this myth of the lone scholar. And that is at the expense, right, of the students, but also the archivists, the librarians, the technologists, the building staff, the caretakers, everybody who makes what we do possible, but who are generally just erased, right? So I agree with this idea of needing new institutional histories. It's not just English, it's a kind of microcosm within a larger culture. So reorienting the labor of humanities scholarship around collaboration was also really embedded in the course design, thanks in part to the forced online format of the pandemic and Zoom, but also because of the model that Laura and Rachel presented of collaborative authorship right up front. I mean, it's baked into the method of how they developed the book and how they undertook their research over, a decade or more, and the care with which they acknowledged each other's labor. So we ran the course asynchronously, and the students participated in a collaborative notes document that was ongoing. They, before class, reflected on the readings, and then we had our class discussion for about 2 hours. And then after class, they had to respond in a second collaborative notes document with comments and feedback to each other. And, it kind of was ongoing throughout the course of the week. So in that way, we created really our own teaching archive of the class, and we documented and we experimented with timed writing. We began every class with silent reading of what everybody had written. So we just got together, said hello, and then we would turn off the cameras, read for about 10 or 20 minutes, and actively make comments on the Google Doc, and then we would jump into discussion. So we really felt that we were taking out this mantle of a kind of exercise in collective knowledge building that Laura and Rachel had been revealing to us had been happening all along, but we were also very careful to provide as much documentation as we could. And I think I have time to read just a couple quick comments from the first class where we introduced the Teaching Archive, one from Madeline Gambino, who's a PhD student in religion, and she wrote, "I really appreciated reading the Teaching Archives with the other sources for this week. The emphasis, especially in the third chapter, on the social product and nature of language, literature, and data, put the historical development of DH and DH methods into much clearer focus and perspective. After our conversation last night, it makes me wonder if it's the digital that concerns or worries humanists, the quantitative aspect, or the acknowledgement of the social collaborative nature of data collection or interpretation and research, or all three." And another student, Sarah Tridenti, a PhD student in history, asked, "Do digital formats necessitate a certain level of collaboration? How can we better foster communities of information exchange? Is some level of authority or expertise lost when we dissolve the myth of the lone scholar?" I think that's my timer. So I would just close by saying that the students felt like the teaching archive book facilitated an openness to thinking collaboratively and to also paying attention to the collaborative nature of everything that they were doing. It facilitated a kind of self-reflexivity about their disciplinary formations. And now, thanks to the collaborative notes and documents that we created, I have a teaching archive that is really hard to look at, that also gives me a non-ephemeral record of the incredible work that my colleague did as a teacher. She was an incredible teacher and collaborator, and I'm most grateful to Laura and Rachel for this book, because it opens up new ways of convincing our profession that that kind of labor in the classroom really counts the most. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Meredith. It's really moving to hear a little more also about your collaboration with Rebecca Munson. Our next speaker is Andrea Kasten-Vange, who specializes in Victorian literature, chaired the English department at Macalester College for the past 4 years, and directed the Digital Liberal Arts at Macalester Initiative for the last 2. She also thinks about public understandings of the value of the humanities, including public intellectual work, digital humanities efforts, and debates about humanities careers, higher education funding, pedagogy, and what the humanities are good for. She's the editor of Thinking About the Humanities, a searchable collection of articles about the state of the humanities.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, and I've been furiously writing down all sorts of things that I'm really excited for us to keep talking about. So thank you, Nathan, for inviting me to be part of this. I wanted to start with what I think is really brilliant core nugget of this book, the idea of centering the classroom not as a recipient space of research knowledge, but as an inspiration for it, as a generative first place for research work to begin, as a framing ground, which resonated so much for me, in part because I was thinking back to all those times in my career when I've had to, stand up and give a job talk or write a statement or whatever it is, and talk about the ways that my research and teaching work together, and I have never been able to say anything except that they were absolutely mutually constitutive. And so and people would be like, sort of, oh yes, that's such a really good observation, as though it wasn't just obvious to me and to so many people, not just me, right? That this is how our work happens, is through those kinds of collaborative conversational moments, not amongst some sort of elite set of colleagues, but with our students, and with pages of text that we're all sort of together trying to make sense of. So I want to throw out a couple of provocations for discussion today in terms of how we talk to students about the value of the work of this book in the teaching archive, and by extension, how we talk to their families about why it matters. And so I want to step back for just a second and say that the first 15 years of my career, I was a professor at Eastern Michigan University, which is a regional state institution in a post-industrial state that is radically underfunding higher ed. And my students there were by and large first-gen college students who were paying their own way, sometimes working full-time at night and going to school full-time during the day. It's a pretty different place from Macalester, where I am now and where I've been for 6 years. But the students in both places, I think, share a sense of needing to know what's going to happen next after college and why the things they're studying matters. And I found myself, as I was reading this book, thinking a lot about a student at Eastern who said to me, that she had gone through her whole life at school basically being told that the kinds of books she was reading in my Victorian studies classroom were not for her. And that not for me or not for us is actually how she framed it. They were not for us, was a message that she got from a sense that there was this literary value that inhered in the text itself, which I think Rachel and Laura do a really, really good job of unpacking that mythology, but also that this was a message that she got from her teachers, and it was a message that she got in her classrooms, right? That these books are not practical. It was a message she got from her parents and her community, like, what are you going to do with, reading Shakespeare or understanding George Eliot? Like, these things are not for you because A, you are not elite enough to understand them properly, and B, you don't have any use value for them further down the road, right? And one of the things I found so striking about this book is that in, Spurgeon's classroom and Reading's classrooms and Eliot's classrooms, there's no remedial, there's no wrong answers, there's no books that aren't for you. There's this intensely collaborative sense that it's worth taking all texts seriously, and it's worth taking all readers seriously, and all readers are equally sort of valuable in honing skills, working on practices, not doing some sort of like mysterious decoding work where there's some right answer you're trying to find, but that there is this kind of knowledge production that happens through that engagement, and that anybody who wants to engage rigorously with the text is perfectly, not just perfectly capable of doing so in some sort of way that's like condescending from the text itself, but that they will be part of this collaborative effort of knowledge production and greater understanding. And I find that really inspiring about this book, which leads me to wonder how we move from the what or the how to the why. So by that I mean, I think this book does this sort of brilliant job of showing us that historically, university has not meant Ivy League. That academic intellectual rigor is for everyone. That scholarship and teaching are mutually framed, and that thinking in those terms about our own discipline, in some ways, puts us all in the same boat instead of pitting us against each other in ways that the sort of like research versus teaching or rank-based ways of thinking about whose work matters more continually tries to do. Because what it does then is set us up against this bit at the very, very end. If we really wish to think about how large-scale institutional changes in the second half of the 20th century profoundly and radically altered how English professors work, we need to look at major changes in funding structures that left both humanities faculty and the general public with the sense that humanities teaching and humanities research were vastly different. And so, I mean, I do think one really important consequence here is that if we think about research and teaching as so intertwined, it also helps us see that in many ways we are all at the mercy of these funding structures, right? That is the thing that has created such problems for us, and maybe there's some way forward that is collaborative amongst us, but it still leaves me with the question of how do we explain why this kind of study matters to students who have been receiving this message that either they're not capable of this kind of study or it's not practical to them, right? So how do we get from this really inclusive set of classrooms, this incredible sense that historically we've had these hugely dedicated teachers invested in all kinds of students, not just Ivy League students, to why it's worthwhile, like what is the language that we might all sort of jointly come to explain why this kind of study is important in a language that doesn't just pit elite liberal arts models against the sort of operationalized job training teaching, right? So this is a real question, not a sort of like, now I'm going to give you the answer. This is like a thing I hope we can talk about in the discussion. Yeah, so I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And you've given me a lot to work with too, with this question about kind of framing value and framing thoughts about this kind of strange thing that we've come to about kind of, vocation or pleasure, right? Use or uselessness, which I think people will have a lot to say about, I hope. So I'm the last of our presenters, and we'll hear a response from Rachel and Laura, the authors of this marvelous book. So it's probably about time I introduced myself. So I'm Rebecca Ariel Port, and I'm a member of the core faculty at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, which is a sort of critical graduate school for the masses, about which I'll say a little more in a minute. I teach there a kind of range of courses in philosophy and theory and literature. And it's important, I think, that my classroom may look a little different from those of most of yours. I don't teach undergraduates. I teach working adults primarily. So I'm so excited to be a part of this event, not only because I value so much the work of the book, but also because I do not come from an academic context, and I'm really interested to see what kinds of conversations and what kinds of solidarities might emerge when we think beyond the realm of the academy. And I'll recur to Nadine's question of earlier, what does this book make possible, and what does it open up in the world, maybe beyond the kind of discipline itself, right? What are the other potential applications? And I think there are potentially many. So I'm going to do something that's just a little camp, for which I hope you'll forgive me, which is to read the mission statement of my organization to give you a better sense of where I'm coming from. So I also do this at the beginning of every class that I teach. So if that takes away the sting any. So the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research is an interdisciplinary teaching and research institute that offers critical community-based education in the humanities and social sciences. Working in partnership with local businesses and cultural organizations, we integrate rigorous but accessible scholarly study with the everyday lives of working adults and reimagine scholarship for the 21st century. So I have sort of three kinds of lessons and possibilities that I want to speak about briefly before we hear from Rachel and Laura. And they have to do with what I've taken from this book and how one might think about kind of building on or expanding its project. So firstly, I'll say, this whole graduate school for the masses thing is something I can talk about kind of structurally in more detail if people are interested, but it is a project that is directly kind of in response to experiences of austerity and sort of the structural problems that inform the way that all of us have to operate in traditional institutional contexts. So we exist to serve a student population that is diverse along almost every axis that you can think of. It is, race, gender, class, a range of exposure to the classroom, right? We have people who have never been in a seminar setting before. We have people who maybe finished college and missed it, people who are aspiring or actual graduate students, full professors who are embarrassed that they've never read Kant, and they shouldn't be embarrassed, but they are, and a range of other people who come from many sorts of different levels of education and interests and subject positions. So you name it, we almost certainly have it. It is interesting to think about how the Teaching Archive asks us, or asks me, to think about what the Brooklyn Institute does in a much longer genealogy of projects that are thinking in and with and also beyond the academy at the same time. I do not want to make the mistake of saying that Visser owes nothing to kinds of thoughts about disciplinarity or academic convention, even though kind of there is a certain amount of undisciplining that goes along with the shift in population. So next, I also just want to introduce this concept of the public good, right? Which many people are familiar with in the economic context, right? It's this commodity or a service that is provided without profit, right, to members of the society, right? So, so healthcare is often conceived in this way, or it should be. I think education ought to be as well, but it's a concept that is really one that we have a hard time keeping in mind, right? It's very much kind of deteriorated in light of current conditions. So those kinds of terms in mind, what I would like to do is to go through my sort of 3 lessons or 3 possibilities. So one, I've gestured at already, Visser's mission is part of a much longer history of literary study beyond the university, which is intimately intertwined with labor conditions and economic movements within and beyond the academy. And I think one of the things that this book does really beautifully, in part dealing with sort of extension school stuff and in part dealing with the variety of institutions that it does, is that it shows us that to lose sight of that web, which links, and I'll cite Moten and Harney, that term, the undercommons, which comes up in the conclusion of the book, to lose sight of that web would not be, just merely a small mistake, but kind of fatal, right? Or a sort of fatalism. And so one of the things that I think that it encourages us to do, although not in a programmatic way, for which I'm grateful more or less, is to think about in what ways it is good to think about teaching an investment in the questions that our discipline asks and the methods that it uses beyond the kinds of classrooms with which many of us may be familiar with as well, and to see where those interests might lie together. I can tell you from personal experience that there is a great hunger for what goes on in your classrooms, in the world beyond them. Many of you know that, many of you probably taught in other contexts as well. But it's worth reiterating, right, that we would not exist unless there were a desire for us to exist. So 2, Visser students, we have at least one here, hi. So Visser students have a wide spectrum of motives for studying with us. And we don't just teach literature or philosophy, it's also social theory, mathematics, classics, sociology, history, it's, anything that might qualify under the rubric of the liberal arts, or the term that we often prefer, the social arts, falls under that rubric. So Visser students have a wide range of motives for studying with us, all of which have a politics, right? Everything does, not all of which are explicitly political, right? Somebody who takes my class on the Divine Comedy, right, might have a very different motive for coming to it than somebody who is interested, for instance, in one of the courses that we teach on, say, Islamic feminisms, right? Some of these motives might include pleasure. It's often a part of it, a resistance to a thoroughgoing structural austerity. And I'm talking about sort of entering into adult life and feeling that your mind has been instrumentalized, right? That your labor has been instrumentalized, that your time has been instrumentalized, and indeed much of your human activity, right? And often that kind of much abused term neoliberal is used to describe some of this kind of experience of atomization and instrumentalization, right? That many people go through. So the inaccessibility of other forms for critical thought is a part of why we do what we do. The idea is to kind of create sort of radically accessible education, right? Keeping tuition very low and including many pay what you will scholarships, et cetera, and really trying to compensate labor what they are worth. It's also a really important part of the project. It's also about a desire to forge social ties based on collective thought and solidarities based on deep investments in the aesthetic, historical, economic, philosophical, and political questions that inform the daily lives of the people who study with us. The idea that they too have a stake in the way that the world is arranged. And for all too many people, it is arranged very badly, right? So it is an intellectual question for them, but it is not merely an intellectual question for them. And there are many people for whom these things are not disseverable. The idea that you have to have a kind of life of the mind in order to have some sense of well-being, or in order to live your life. So how they use these conversations cannot be predicted in advance. And I think on the whole that it would be much worse if it could be, right? Some people will have practical uses for them. Some people will have, entirely kind of internal sorts of revolutions, right, or changes in their lives because of these things. And for some people, there may be no kind of result at all, right? It's very, hard, notoriously hard to measure the results of what we do. And I think that any document that helps us to sort of relieve ourselves of that particular pressure of the assessment that I know many people labor under in their teaching lives is one that I think is worth thinking with. So 3.
We're almost at it. We're past time here, just so you know.
Okay, good. So I'll just say very, very briefly that the point here is that literary study will look different in the future, and we can't predict in advance how it will look. And I think that on the whole is also a kind of pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will type thing. So I'll stop myself here at the risk of trying anyone's patience. And let's move to the response from Laura and Rachel. So I have bios here in 2 places. So I'll read Laura's first. So Laura Heffernan is Associate Professor at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. She is co-author with Rachel Sagner-Burma of the Teaching Archive, and she is currently at work on a book about how scholars taught modernist literature in the early 20th century, provisionally titled Unliterary Critics, to be published by Columbia University Press. So Rachel Sagner-Burma is Associate Professor of English at Swarthmore College and co-director of the Ada Lott Foundation for the Liberal Arts. She teaches courses on 19th century literature and culture, the history of the novel, literary informatics, and book history, and has recently published essays on book indexes, Anthony Trollope, and reading in the digital age.
Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that introduction and for your response to the Teaching Archive. And I think the first thing we want to do is just thank Nathan profusely and everyone, Stacy, Nadine, Meredith, and Andrea, Rebecca again, for these wonderful, generous, interesting responses to our book. I just can't tell you how amazing it is to see people using the book in their classrooms and thinking with the book to do their own work, or critiquing the book to do their own work. It's incredibly exciting.
Yeah, I echo that as well. And we didn't really prepare comments because we weren't sure what you were all going to say, but I do think that there's some common threads here that we could speak a little bit about. And that we could maybe even talk a little bit about like sort of how we think generationally about the ways that this project came about for us. We usually tell the story as it centers on how we co-taught a class in 2009 called Close Reading and Its Discontents that aimed to give a pretty standard history of the discipline, but also found that things that were kind of, that we had learned as received ideas weren't obvious to our students and really needed to be explained in different ways. And then we started thinking about the new critics in particular, and this imaginary of the new critical classroom, how dominant it had been, and wondering what it actually looked like. But there is really, kind of another narrative to how we started the book, which is that we started graduate school together in 1999 at a moment when, the internet was starting to happen. We had a really early website in our department among the graduate students that was called TeachWeb, that we used to use HTML coding to put up early teaching documents to share. And it was exciting and totally kind of a peer-to-peer mentoring program. We were teaching each other how to do that sort of web publishing, also teaching each other how to teach. And then, a year or two later, the graduate student union at Penn got started, and Rachel and I were both working on unionization for pretty much all of our graduate careers. And I think there's a real, story to tell there about this particular moment of kind of how the digital invites collaboration, that speaks to some of Meredith's comments about the class that she co-taught with Rebecca.
but that also is about this other version of disciplinary practice that we got by working kind of more for each other than for a kind of hierarchical sort of structure that is, I think, pretty crucial and has given us a really different, as many of you have said, kind of a hunger for a reflection of our past that shows us the longer history of those kinds of practices. And I do, I think that in a way is kind of at the heart of what's been at stake in the response to the book, both positive and negative. That there is kind of this, that version of our collective history is very, very different from the lone scholar sort of version that people are very attached to for reasons that are worth thinking about and talking about here today.
This is really, can I?
Yeah, no,
this is like a footnote, but it comes up especially around the T.S. Eliot chapter, which because it's in some ways the most canonical and the biggest rereading or the biggest use of the teaching archive to reread for people like John Guillory in his review in the London of our book in London Review of Books. It's like, that's the hot spot. Like John Guillory really believes that T.S. Eliot was lecturing in a condescending way about literature to his working class students. And we don't believe that. And there's some evidence on both sides, I have to be perfectly honest. But that is kind of like, I think, a shorthand for this larger problem about how we tell the story of the discipline, whatever discipline. I mean, I think also Nadine's response made me think too, obviously the teaching archive, and I really appreciated her call for more work of this kind and more work that attends to stuff that even is more imagined as service work, but is really institution building work that there's, and that documents like the Cornell Radical Caucus Archive, which I wasn't familiar with, and I'm really excited to learn more about, are yet even another alternate version of how we create institutions and how we create collectivities inside and outside institutions. Sorry, Laura, I want to go back to that, but I just wanted to.
No, absolutely. And I was also thinking about the Guillory review a little bit as well. And particularly the moment when he says that this book would look really different if you just took out the chapters about women. Which, I think does sort of get to this question, this sort of touchy kind of subject around how we think about who's made our past and how to hang on to it. I think this all relates to the kind of big question that I think a lot of people here addressed, which is sort of meta discourse. Who is it for? These ways that we have, this came up in Meredith's talk when she was asking who does it give power to speak about divides in our discipline? Who does that benefit? And Andrea talking about how we frame the question of how this study matters. And then, Stacy's point, which I really appreciate, about not pitting kind of online teaching against some ideal in-person version of kind of humanistic collaboration or exchange. And then Rebecca's really nice, sort of catalog of all the different things that people get out of, how impossible it would really be. There is this sort of big sense that there is kind of an anti-instrumental. There's this way in which, studying at the BISR, relieves them from the feeling of being kind of instrumentalized in other spheres of life. But that beyond that, there's not a really easy way to kind of describe what it does for everyone and how that works. And I think this gets at the question, that we were really dissatisfied around, which is that the seemingly available ways to talk about the value of literary study, they just seemed really abstract and kind of polarized. And often, you would be describing them in anti-economic terms as a kind of bulwark against the instrumentalization of neoliberalism, or you would be describing them kind of in economic terms, sort of trying to describe what's valuable for students in all kinds of ways about what we do in terms of, job futures and so on, or even something like, I'm totally blanking on his name at Penn State, Humanistic Reason, new book, which is, I think, sort of, who is it, Rebecca?
Eric Hay.
Eric
So
Haler.
Eric Haler.
Sorry, Eric, if you
The
watch.
one you mean?
I totally know you and your great book, which is also about kind of framing the value of what we do in terms that other disciplines can understand. And I think there is just this kind of dissatisfaction that we felt around these like equally, you know, kind of abstract versions of this valuation, when in fact, like going into work every day just felt really different from that. And the sort of futility of talking to people, like I was trying to imagine at the time talking to our then governor, who had passed legislation basically disincentivizing humanities majors. And, you know, just imagining how that conversation would go down with somebody who just literally never experienced anything like a liberal arts education, like, and trying to explain it, you know, instead of just being like, well, just try it, you know, like, just go and see, like, and the difference between kind of those two things, the doing of it and the talking about the value of it, and trying to kind of bring those two things really much closer together. I also just wanted to say quickly that like Nadine, I really appreciated your comments as well, and the call for even more classrooms in more places. Like I really hear that as both, you know, a kind of a positive comment and like a bit of a critique as well. And I think that that's really important too. And I just wanted to highlight that also.
Yes, I think just going back really briefly to what Laura was saying about teaching, how we started thinking about this book, we're teaching a traditional class in history of the discipline, but also working for the Graduate Student Union in different roles, and how those, at the time, I didn't see the connection between those two things at all. And it's actually only with the reception of the book that I'm getting closer, you know, and closer to having an account that I could hardly say for myself yet, right, of how the two things might go together, because they seem so distant. I mean, the distance between even a vastly expanded version of the teaching archive or a different version of the teaching archive and a kind of reorganization of the terms and social and economic structures of higher education that is a common thread, I think, in all of the talks today, implicit or explicit, that like a radical and liberatory extension education that would almost replace the system of higher education with its sorting and its polarizing and its credentializing that's seemingly divorced from what happens in classrooms, is another one of these binaries that both we have to think beyond, right? I think Chad Willman and Paul Reiter's new book, Permanent Crisis, is another interesting take on the binary between what I think Chad and Paul think of as the academy and the other university, right? That real learning and the student life-ized administrative university, which I think they also take apart and question as well as position. But as we all know from our own classrooms and from our own encounters with institutions, learning doesn't happen outside of institutions, whatever kind of institutions they are. And so I don't have an answer for, right, the big rift between the kind of small laborious work of archival reconstructions of classrooms to better imagine our single disciplines multiple past in a way that might look towards a slightly different future or make us more comfortable with working for a different future. But I do think that listening to your talks made me realize more strongly that though we often think of professors, instructors, people in higher education as being super bad at collectivity and organizing, that we have so much experience in it in the ways that all of you have described, and the way I hope the teaching archive also shows. So I do wonder, in kind of a modest way, what kind of resource that might be in a more practical and concrete way for thinking about the work of organizing, institution building. A little bit of what Nadine described or is imagining redescribing the service work. But I think we could open it up for more discussion.
Can I just briefly reply to the last thing that you said? It's not, I want to open up for everybody because I realized I was a speaker. But one of the parts of this kind of collaborative enterprise, collective enterprise that I think we do have immediate power over is just writing our CVs differently. was something that, this is something that's been going on a little bit in the DH world, but and I'm sure you've seen people kind of sharing new formats of the syllabus, but instead of putting your individual research at the top, putting the, sort of collaborative, collective work that you do and framing it differently. Like I'm thinking about writing infrastructure as infrastructure building, institution building as something that's at the top, just like putting the service and the teaching to the front all the time, as if it's, just this little tiny change that can maybe ripple out. I don't know. That was just like the first thing that I thought when you were like, what would be like the takeaway, the easy takeaway? I think that would just, for me, it was just like, let's just start doing that. Let's call it infrastructure building, institution building, radical reimagining, whatever, because that is labor. It is so time consuming and we never give ourselves credit for it or give each other credit for it or talk about it in really meaningful ways on paper in that evaluative form. So we could just start doing that.
Thanks, Meredith. I want to call on Jesse right now, but before we do that, I just want to thank everybody so much for your incredible talks and for, Rachel and Laura, your really beautiful impromptu response. I've learned so much, and I know that we've had people coming in and out who've been saying that in the chat, but thank you all so much for this. Okay, I won't say any more. Jesse.
There's no need to rush to me.
No, I want to hear from you. I don't want to hear from me. Go ahead.
I want to echo the thanks. I don't want to take up all of our time by echoing the thanks, but everything everyone has said about this incredible book and the organization to put this together and all the speakers, I appreciate it so much. I haven't enjoyed reading a book in so long as much as I've enjoyed reading this one. One of the things that this book makes me think about is obviously the visibility of teaching archives or the invisibility of teaching archives. And, you talk in the book about how, certain documents remain, right? There's, you can get syllabi and you can get, lesson plans and quizzes and all these sorts of things. And, we share that today, especially, social media has made it, much more possible. The internet has made it much more possible to share teaching materials. We share tools, but that, the archive of what happens in the classroom, that sort of alchemy, the magic of discussion and interpretation is lost. You say in the book, if you missed it, it's gone forever. And I love that. It's so true. I want to, tell that to students. I don't know if I have the nerve, but I'll try. But the visibility of each other's classrooms in real time is something that we actually, I feel like we do have access to, but we don't take advantage of. And I guess my sort of, at the risk of offering more of a comment than a question, maybe this is more of a vent than a question, but I often think about how we don't visit each other's classrooms except in a hierarchical context of evaluation. That your senior colleague visits you to evaluate you for, tenure and promotion. And you talk so beautifully about how the classroom is this space where knowledge is produced. And I think, so many scholars feel, if they can't go to that conference, then they've missed something ephemeral. They've missed a place where knowledge is produced by not being able to attend that conference. But it's happening all around us all the time, through that wall and that wall and that wall, we're missing these sites of knowledge production. And, I just have the sense that people don't feel that loss or feel that way or feel that they want to rush into their colleague's classroom, not to get a lesson plan idea, but to hear new knowledge being made, to influence their own work, to bring together their research and teaching, to sit in on a classroom the way we sit in on a talk, a job talk, or a conference talk, or that sort of thing. So I guess my question is kind of like, how do we wrest that back away? The idea of the classroom visit. How do we wrest that back away from the institutional structures and the hierarchical structures of evaluation and so quote unquote observation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a really good question.
Well, can I?
Yeah.
I just said in the chat, and this is something I'd like to actually to bring up is, it seems to me that this is something that COVID has actually been good for. That this past year we have all, partly for reasons of survival and partly for reasons of pushing back against the demands on us. Of this incredibly difficult time, we've all visited more classrooms in more different capacities than ever before. And it strikes me that that's something that we should push to maintain. We should push to see this constructing a syllabus, constructing a course as a collaborative enterprise and as something that is that is welcoming and communal, and that we needn't think of as, you know, our own special private defensive space, but rather, you know, a space in which we welcome people who are helping us shape that process.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, definitely COVID is, I mean, or just that moved everything online has helped create. I see Nathan saying in the chat that Joanna, who has left the call, but, you know, did a guest lecture in his class. And I know a lot of people have stories like that. I think even beyond, like Rachel and I co-taught actually my class this spring. Rachel was on research leave this year, but she and I recorded lectures together for a novel and social media class that we've kind of separately taught before, and this time we kind of did it together. And that we've been thinking a lot also just about co-teaching classes across different kinds of institutions, and how actually kind of easy that is, and how you know, how you might imagine that a Swarthmore class and a class at my regional public would look really different, but actually they look very, very similar, and they function exactly the same. And so, and you know, there's a question of like, kind of why would we not be doing more of this? Why would this not be an extension of our disciplinary professional networks, where we do all kinds of kind of collaborative scholarship work across different kinds of institutions, but in a way that kind of erases the institutional you know, foundations of those two scholars. I see like Andy Hines is also on the call, and Andy and Rachel are working on this Ada-Lot Liberal Arts Foundation at Swarthmore. And I know that they have also been thinking kind of longer term post-COVID about how to hang on to those kinds of pedagogical experiments across different institutions. Rachel, I don't know if you want to talk about that.
And just how to fund, like what the value and interest of imagining cross-institutional connection of classrooms as almost a form of extension education, or as like what we in such a class polarized, economically polarized higher education scene, that connecting different types of institutions that have very different kinds of resources and sharing resources like intellectual as well as material is an interesting project. We just failed to get the grant we applied for first to do this project.
I'm sorry I brought it up then.
The Mellon Foundation isn't interested in. I shouldn't have put that on a recorded call, but we're pressing on. I also think that people have been doing this more and more, also especially DH adjacent people, but all kinds of people who have been excited I mean, it seemed more exciting 10 or 15 years ago what the internet could do for our classrooms, I think, than it does anybody today. But I think there has been a fair amount of this work, but it doesn't have a name, this interinstitutional connecting of classes, but it doesn't have a name or a big place in our professional networks, as Laura's pointing out, and it doesn't get archived or talked about together. So it would be interesting also to see how much exists and how it might be formalized in a way that doesn't shut down possibilities, but opens them up. And I see in the chat, Nadine is saying that something I did a number of times this year with friends, colleagues, was record conversations with them about a creative or scholarly text, showing students another dimension of the collaborative work that goes into knowledge production. And it was interesting to see the students come back with the same types of projects. Yeah, I think that's another example of the same kind of work that just is invisible because, as Stacy pointed out, online teaching we've packed so many preconceptions about what happens in online teaching and who it's for and who it isn't for, even during the pandemic, despite its expansion. If we could undo that, yeah.
I think we have a couple of hands. I see Andrea and then Patrick, and then Matt has a kind of separate question in the chat. So do you all want to go in that order maybe? And then if you haven't already had an introduction read, if you don't mind saying who you are and stuff, that would be great also. Andrea.
Yeah, I love sort of collaborative teaching or the visiting in each other's classrooms, but I do think that it is fundamentally different to go teach in someone else's classroom where you don't know the students and you've never met them before, than it is to go sit in someone's classroom and watch them teach their class, where that has been sort of developed as a community, and that you know, I have been railing against that as a thing that only happens for like institutional valuative purposes for a really long time. And so one of the things that I started suggesting when I was chair was just like a sort of like buddy system of, you know, pair up, go sit in on each other's classes, don't write anything about it, don't turn in anything about it, tap in, you know, you can each have $5 from the department fund or whatever it is to go have coffee afterwards. Like the only rules are you each go sit in each other's classrooms for a period and then talk about what you see, just as a way of like seeing what other people are doing and being inspired by that and thinking about, you know, and maybe somewhere down the road, you're going to have to write a letter for somebody and you can sort of talk about that experience as part of that letter, but that the point of the visit was not evaluative in any way, and that there was there were no stakes other than just having a conversation, in part because I crave, like I have brilliant colleagues and friends and peers all over the place. Like I would love to be a fly on the wall in their classrooms. And I think that we ought to be pushing more for that to become institutionalized as a collaborative practice as opposed to an evaluative one, because I think it might help us all think about teaching and sort of archives of those, you know, those processes as valuable.
Great, thanks, Andrea. Patrick, and then we'll read Matt's question after.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. And it's good to see you, by the way. So I'm Patrick Fessenbecker, and I let me echo all the thanks for organizing this. I'm calling you from Ankara, and it sometimes gets pretty lonely out here for Victorianists. So I'm really thrilled to be able to do this kind of thing. So thanks. Right. So forgive me if this got covered either in the book or later. It's been a long day, and I was putting kids to bed. But there's this moment at one point, you guys make this point that a lot of the dichotomies that have structured the discipline get undermined if we look at teaching practice as opposed to the theory. And that seems absolutely right to me. And then one of your examples is a lot of practices that seem opposed to aesthetic value, in fact, reappear as versions of value when you look at how they work in the classroom. That a practice like historicism or whatever that seems to be not about valuing the text actually is a way of valuing the text when you understand how it works in the classroom. That seems entirely correct to me. I was wondering, what do you mean by the word value in that construction? And that can be for either Rachel or Laura.
Well, Rachel is the Victorianist.
It's true. You're the modernist. And so maybe have the more immediate access to the ways we think about literary value in a contemporary way. But I think that we're trying to oppose a sense of people knowing what I think in many ways we're talking about aesthetic value or something that's been misrecognized as purely aesthetic value, right? That inheres in a literary object and is like revealed by close reading or formalist approaches, and trying to show that especially in the historicist ways that have their roots in the 19th, as Nathan and many others here know, have their roots in 19th century practices, that social production and the social production of literary objects and of the material texts that literary objects live in and are born by is a form of value itself, right? So a more materialist and social form of value, and that the reading that we do in classrooms is yet another piece of that value creation, right? And that like primarily literary value comes from, and you can think about this philosophically in a number of ways, but primarily literary value comes from people creating and interpreting literature together, right? It's the whole kind of life cycle of a literary text that creates its value. So that's what we're saying.
And my other favorite example of this in the book is when Cleanth Brooks is teaching his modern poetry class at Yale, and he's got this really serious theory of value. You know, poems that are essentially about poetry are valuable poems, and poems that are not, are not really even poems at all. But consequently, he's teaching Marianne Moore, in that class and her poems as failures, right? As failed poetry. And if you just read his scholarship, right, then you'll get a theory of value and you'll believe that Marianne Moore isn't valuable, to Cleanth Brooks. And yet he's teaching her semester after semester, and there's something there. There's something going on there that's fascinating to him about her poem. And then there is, again, the matter of the fact that all of his students are reading that poem every semester, and who knows what they're taking from that poem and moving on with. So you just get this kind of different picture, right, about that is more about what gets included and not included, what gets discussed, what gets tied in to the theoretical frameworks and to the other poems in the later weeks, and that a kind of a value emerges through that that's not theorized in the Well-Wrought Urn, but is absolutely practiced in the classroom.
Great, thank you.
Nathan, do you want me to just give a brief background to my question?
Yeah, would you mind? I would be happy to read it, but if you don't mind, why don't you go ahead? Yeah,
it's no problem. I'll try to keep it really brief. Kind of three things have happened recently that are asking me to rethink how I'm preparing. One is I teach at an institution, like all of you, it seems that's probably different from everyone else. I teach at a Southern Baptist seminary that has a very small liberal arts college that has historically been a feeder to the seminary. And so I grew up in that world and then went and did PhD stuff and then came back to that world, a completely different human person. And many of my colleagues have only ever lived in that world, and much of what they write are their notes for class, which they then have printed and make available to students, or which students have to buy, not like for profit or anything, but just like at the print shop on campus. The other thing is we are way behind and only just now getting to a place where we are honoring, in the spirit of it, ADA, accessibility and accommodations. And so having more and more students who realize they can seek accommodations to have an equitable learning environment has flooded my inbox with emails asking for notes in advance and so on. And ironically, for many of my colleagues who might be a little skeptical of ADA and that kind of thing, they have the notes to give. And this has been something that's pushed me to develop notes better, and then reading this book. And so I've been really rethinking preparation for class. And I just wanted to hear maybe from Laura and Rachel, especially, but for anybody, how their experiences in reading this book might be influencing the way they think about, maybe not their notes as a future archive. Maybe we're not all a J. Saunders Reading, but how we're preparing for class.
Rachel and Laura, do you mind taking the lead on that? It's an awesome question about almost like the strategic reification of the teaching moment, which is always a performance that slips away from the archive somehow, but how to consolidate and whether to.
I mean, it did make me looking at these archives did make me believe there's always the old chestnut that we all exchange at the beginning of the semester, or actually in the middle of the semester, about how you can prepare for hours and the class goes badly and you can fly by the seat of your pants and you have a brilliant class and you wish you recorded it. And so not taking that to any extreme, but I think looking at these archives and seeing Josephine Miles as actually brilliant teaching, which relied on 40 years, right, or 20 or 5 years of her experience and her repetition of a class like English 1B with all different kinds of students and care and interest in all those different kinds of students and writers and their individual sentences, right? That she didn't have to prepare notes for hours. She jotted down some sentences she wanted to return to, but she had in her mind, and partly in her teaching papers, which she didn't necessarily refer to herself, but which we did, right? An archive of responses and pedagogical structures and exercises. So I think that has helped me. I've been teaching for 20 years now at the college level, and I still get stressed out about not preparing for, 10 hours for a class. And I think the thing I've learned more and more, and also because our own student body at Swarthmore has changed in the last 10 or 15 years, Stacy's point about how the restrictions on online teaching formats and institutional demands for knowing the content of those ahead of time, and making the content, like ownable and discoverable to the university ahead of time, really can shut down our ability to assess individually what our students individually and as a collective need in a given class and in a given semester. And I think I realized that my own over preparation in some ways was then under attending to what individual students, but also the collectivity of the class needed. And so over the last decade, I've tried to shift, especially my upper level seminar teaching, a bit more to leave a lot more space. I'm not at the point of like T.S. Eliot second year collective syllabus building, but to leave a lot more space to imagine the lives and demands and interests of the students. And Laura, I know you have more to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would give a slightly different answer, which is that one of the things that was really illuminating for me about doing the research in this book is how often people were teaching seemingly like graduate level kinds of pedagogy to beginning students. I think this kind of goes back a little bit to Rebecca's point about how they run things at the VISR, but it also, Scott Selisker has a comment here about the book enabling him to speak back to kind of what he calls the centralization and middle managementification of pedagogy expertise, specifically like revamping gen ed in a discipline expertise hostile, casualization friendly way. So, I mean, I felt sort of more emboldened to do sort of weird scholarly things with, my kind of freshman students, like freshman writing students, or do lectures and online courses when, people in the Center for Teaching and Learning had said nothing more than 5 minutes, to really just kind of go for it with classes that didn't seem to be kind of hierarchically arranged in that particular way, which did change how I was doing class prep materials a little bit. So I think that's my answer to that. Yeah.
I see. I don't know if others.
There's such a lively conversation happening in the chat that it's
actually. I wanted to give a little shout out to the discussion that's been going on about class visits and the kind of institutional support of them. Or what I was thinking of when I was trying to catch up on it was this sort of ghost of hierarchy that lives even in the supposedly horizontal efforts of some of us where I myself get like incredibly nervous if I know that someone's going to see me teach, even if I've been assured that it's a non-hierarchical situation in the way. So I just wonder how much we've sort of internalized some of the hierarchy, obviously, but then also Rebecca and Laura, I think maybe Laura, do you want to say anything about the sort of questions you were raising in the chat about, I don't mean to call you out, but I know that there's something going on here about class visitation and the institutional sort of infrastructures that enable or disable that.
Right, so I'm Laura Hartman Vialta. I'm a part-time adjunct at Georgetown in Nathan's department, and I just assumed the directorship of the Engaged and Public Humanities Master's Program at Georgetown. So this conversation has gotten me sparking in all kinds of ways. But in my adjunct hat, I was thinking that there is such a different level of accessibility for an adjunct like me to approach a tenured or tenure track faculty member who might even teach the same thing that I do or that I present on, say at MSA, and ask if I could visit. Because there is that but you teach writing, what is going on here? And so I often think that at Georgetown, at least, these kinds of connections happen through our Center for Design and Learning. And I'm trying to kind of think about how those conversations, because the center is the non-departmental body that can come and observe you, and it's non-hierarchical, and that is where the expertise in teaching resides, right? And I'm been trying to kind of think of ways in which the center could be useful for facilitating conversations, but then facilitating conversations and actually visiting each other's classes rather than just having the conversations about teaching, which they're great at. There are structures for that, but no one is really encouraged to actually go and see what is happening in each other's classes. And to end, my last comment was I would almost feel more comfortable, say, asking one of my fellow modernists on this call if I could visit your class because you are not a member of my institution and you recognize me as a modernist scholar, not adjunct, and kind of see me as such. And rather than visiting someone at my own institution, which I think could actually be a strength, like which I think could actually be a collaborative strength rather than a comment on hierarchy and precarity. There's other people's hands are raised, but thanks, Nathan. And if anyone wants to take any of that up.
Oh, and I'll just jump in here to say that we are 4 minutes away from 1:30. So I'll ask people to be brief in their comments, and maybe Nathan knows who's next in line to go, or how we should go about winding down. There's always going to be way more to talk about.
I know this could go on, but I do want to respect everyone's time. I think I see Jesse and then Keegan and Andy. And then I think Rebecca wants to say just a final word to close us out at 1:30. So real quick, Jesse and Keegan and Andy, thanks.
Yeah, I'll be super brief because I know I've already spoken, but yeah, I didn't mean for my question to monopolize the whole discussion, but the thing I'm interested in about this issue of classroom visits that I hadn't thought about in this way before reading this book was how much we talk about classroom visits. I think we've all said, oh, I wish I could visit this class, I wish I could visit that class, and that, the Centers for Learning and Teaching, the Teaching Excellence Centers, all these places, think about it in terms of pedagogy, that we go there to learn pedagogy. But what this book opens up for me is, I want to go there to learn about texts. Like I want to go there to learn about, a text I think I already know really well, the same way I go to a conference to learn about it. And I wonder if reframing the way we think about classroom visits can help us open up new ways of asking for them or talking about them, or even, dare I say, institutionalizing them. That's it.
Thanks, Jesse. One more minute.
No, of course. Yeah, and I should say that Keegan had to run and wrestle Blackboard, so it's just me, Andy. But I wanted to just quickly add something to Laura Hartman Vialta was talking about in respect to the institutional obstacles to collaborative work, and just kind of commenting on further without boring people too quickly or speaking too long. With the grant that Rachel and I were working on, was the amount of complexity that working between institutions in terms of thinking about how faculty are paid in various ways, like not just the difference between tenured and tenure track faculty or tenured and non-tenured faculty, but the differences in the ways that some institutions will budget teaching in very different ways than others. And that's something that is definitely not universalized and is definitely made opaque from faculty. And so I think that another dimension of that work, and that this goes back to, I think, an earlier point that Rachel was making about the relationship between, say, the unionization work that her and Laura were doing while writing the book, or during their graduate student days, and this kind of teaching work that they were doing at the same time, was that like these types of, even something as simple as like informal classroom visits, like might involve like an intensive investigation of how university budgeting might work or something like that, so that those things can't fully be separated, even to do these type of work. And that's something that I think we've only learned through experience of trying to like actually implement some of that budgeting across institutions, and finding that it's nearly impossible to do.
Thank you so much for that, Andy. Yeah, the material aspect of all of these intellectual processes is obviously the core of one of the core takeaways here. But Rebecca, will you take us home?
Thank you so much to everyone, to Nathan for bringing me into the fold for this one, to all of our presenters and our participants, and of course to Laura and Rachel for this book that is bringing us together today, Lannan Center for Poetics and Social Practice and the Georgetown Humanities Initiative for providing us with the forum. And I just wanted to end by saying that I hope this is just the beginning of a conversation that will go on a long time. Certainly there's so much more to keep us occupied. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you all so much for this.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much,
Thank
everyone.
you so much, everyone. Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much.